Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. The story of Daniel takes place. Notice on our timeline, you have the kings of Judah up at the top, going to about 586 BC, and then Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. Daniel, his ministry contains that, but actually starts quite a bit earlier in the first deportation of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he had three different deportations, culminating finally in the city of Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple being burnt. And Daniel, by that time, was already in Babylon. Notice his life and ministry spanned the entire period of the Babylonian captivity, at least that as reckoned from the destruction of the temple to the permission of the Jews to return from exile. Now, that does not take into account the final rebuilding of the temple in 516 BC. That's quite a bit later. But notice you've got the Babylonian captivity, and Daniel sees all of that. Remember the story where you'd had the Assyrian Empire had fallen to a coalition of the Medes and the city of Babylon, and they had come in, and Nineveh had been destroyed in 612 BC. From then, the Medes had gone back home, but Nebuchadnezzar, the young crown prince, had continued to Carchemish, and the Egyptian pharaoh Necho had gone out to meet him in that epic battle. And at that battle, Necho lost, Nebuchadnezzar won. And so we read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He comes down from Carchemish to Jerusalem and besieged it. Chapter 1, verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And then we see that he brought them to the land of Shinar. Shinar is another word for Mesopotamia, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And so uh, Jerusalem had been conquered, not destroyed at this point, only conquered. And Jehoiakim is allowed to stay on the throne. He's now going to be a puppet of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's told, don't do any more rebellion against me. And Jehoiakim, that's not going to happen, unfortunately. But Daniel at this point is taken with these vessels to Babylon, both he and some of his friends, as hostages for good behavior. So here's our outline of Daniel. It's divided into two major sections. Chapters 1 through 7 will be written in the third person. That is, we're going to read about Daniel. Daniel did this, Daniel did that. When we get to chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, we'll have Daniel speaking in the first person. He's going to be the speaker of these events. Chapters 1 through 7 will give us 7 historical narratives divided into those 7 chapters. Now, in some of those historical narratives, it's going to be telling us of dreams and visions and things like that, but it's always set up in a historical narrative. Starting in chapter 8, we have 4 prophetic visions that Daniel himself will be relating to us. As we look at that first section, it starts off, as do most of the Bible, it's written in Hebrew, but we get to chapter 2 and verse 3, which says, and the king issued this edict in the Aramaic language. And verse 4 comes, and you start reading of the edict, and it's in Aramaic. But you get to the end of that chapter, and it continues in Aramaic, the entire story, all the way to the end of chapter 7. Like somebody forgot to switch back. Now, Aramaic and Hebrew are close. They're somewhat alike. I usually liken it to, and I might be a little bit more or less. I usually liken it to Portuguese and Spanish, which really are two different ways of speaking Latin, but they have become two languages over the years. And so, if Portuguese is your language, and I've got a number of friends that's their language, and Spanish, that was my mother's maiden language. She was actually from Puerto Rico. So if you can speak Portuguese, you can sort of puzzle out the Latin, although some words are going to be different. And Hebrew and Aramaic are a little like that, maybe a little bit more diverse. They had more time to diversify. But then when you get to chapter 8, verse 1, we go back to Hebrew. So this is the longest section of the Old Testament Bible that's written not in Hebrew but in Aramaic, there's a little portion over in the book of Ezra where the same thing takes place. But most of the rest of the Bible, and sometimes we'll have a loan word. You know how even in English, I can say shalom, and even people that aren't Hebrew will know. Well, that's the word for peace. It's like a greeting. And so we have some words that have been borrowed, and they did too. But here we have an entire section that's in Aramaic. The prologue, I said that Hebrew section begins in chapter 2, verse 4, not the very beginning. Chapter 1 is actually a prologue, and then following that will be chapters 2 through 7 will be the prophetic history relating to the Gentiles. But then when we get to chapter 8, you have prophecy, but it's the prophetic history relating more specifically to the Jews. Sometimes there'll be some overlap, but I still think that there's that Jewish emphasis versus that Gentile emphasis. Now, some features of the book. We just said that it's partially written in Aramaic. There's an emphasis on the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. We're going to see, actually, the word kingdom of heaven is not going to be used, but kingdom of God will. We'll see an emphasis on prayer where Daniel will be praying. At times they'll be praying when they're facing some bad things. And at time in the part where he's telling the story, he's going to be praying to the Lord as well. Not necessarily in a crisis, but just because he has a life of prayer. There is a spiritual battle going on. At one point, we're going to read of an angel showing up, and you almost want to ask what took you so long, because Daniel had been praying for 3 weeks. And the angel says, when you started this prayer, I was sent out. And now I don't know how fast angels take to get anywhere. But he says, I was sent out, but the prince of Persia hindered me. You say, well, what's going on there? A prince of Persia, is that some sort of angelic thing, or was that just a really strong guy? We're not told, but there's more than meets the eye. That's what we pick up in Daniel. There are things going on of which we do not know, and we have a little hint about something going on behind the curtain, but the curtain isn't moved. We're not told. Now, Ezekiel versus Daniel. We already looked at Ezekiel, a priest who spoke of matters of spirit. Daniel is a statesman who speaks on matters of state. He's not a priest. He is going to give some things of prophecy, but he's not primarily a prophet either. Indeed, when we look at the Hebrew way of dividing the Old Testament, they divide it into the Torah, that is the law, the prophets, and the writings. Daniel is not placed with the prophets, he's placed with the writings, which maybe suggests this very idea here. Ezekiel emphasizes the times of Israel's glory. Of course, there's judgment there, but there's glory coming. Daniel emphasizes the times of the Gentiles' glory. We're going to see a lot of emphasis on Gentiles and God working in them and through them. In Ezekiel, he has residence as a prisoner. Well, Daniel had been taken as a prisoner, but he's not in prison. He has his residence in a palace. Now, Ezekiel's not in prison either, but he's banished to an area, and he's not in the nice, comfortable palace as Daniel is. Ezekiel's focus is primarily on Israel and the Jews. Daniel's focus tends to be more a bit on the Gentiles and the world. Again, there's overlap between the two. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Babylon had been there since many, I would say, thousands of years earlier. But in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, it is made the center of the world. Nebuchadnezzar comes on the scene, and he carves out not just the city of Babylon, but he inherits the city of Babylon from his father. But he carves out a kingdom, an early empire, stretching from Egypt all the way to the land of the Persians, with the Euphrates River flowing through the city. Now, notice you've got the big ziggurat, sort of reminds us of the much earlier accounts of the Tower of Babel. And it's right on the Euphrates River. Here you have a picture of the Ishtar Gate. They actually found this gate and were able to reassemble it. Now, they didn't reassemble it in Babylon. What they did is they transported the bricks all the way back to Germany. It was German archaeologists who dug it out. And if you go to Berlin today, you will see the Ishtar Gate. It's been reassembled. You also have legends telling and actually historians telling of the hanging gardens of Babylon. Now, they didn't hang up in the air, they rose up into the air. That's the idea. I'm not sure where we get the word hanging from. But the story goes, I don't know if this is true, but the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar had a wife from the Medes. Remember, the Medes and the Babylonians had entered into an alliance against the Assyrians. And the story goes, it's maybe a fable, but I like the story anyway. That his wife from the mountains of the Medes was homesick for the mountains. You know, they were living in Babylon, which is flat, uh, and so that he made this artificial mountain with water pipes taking water up to the high trees up at the top, and so she could look out her palace window and see this mountain and not be so homesick. That's the story. It's a nice story. Now, as we come to Daniel chapter 1, we find that Daniel makes a commitment, and saw the opening verses of Daniel and others being transported to Mesopotamia, specifically to Babylon. Makes a commitment to purity. We read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He doesn't want to eat non-kosher food and other, I'm not sure all the details here. It doesn't specifically talk about kosher, but still the Jews had some regulations regarding what to eat and drink, and the Babylonians were not necessarily observing those rules. And so he gets permission to do that. And then after the fact, the king talked with them. And out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the Jewish names of the three men that we're going to get to know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're both healthy looking, but they're also wise. And so notice, so they entered the king's personal service. Verse 20, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. The king Cyrus is going to be when the Persians come in and take over at the end of the Babylonian Empire, which, as you see, is only going to last within Daniel's lifetime. It will have risen when he's a young man, and it will cease to be. Now, the city of Babylon is not going to cease to be, but it will no longer be governed as part of the Babylonian Empire. Instead, that will be the Persian Empire in the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, chapters 2 through 7 form a unit. Chapter 1, we said, was sort of a prologue. In chapter 2, we have a dream of an image of four kingdoms, and the king has the dream, and Daniel comes in and interprets it. We're going to come back and look at that. Next, in chapter 3, it's a rescue story. Daniel's friends are thrown into a fiery furnace. Where was Daniel during this point? He's not mentioned, so we don't know. But they are thrown into a fiery furnace, and they survive. And the king looks in and sees that it's not just the three friends, but also there's a fourth person, and it's not Daniel. It's one like the Son of God. And that's just a sort of a bizarre way of seeing that. Next, there is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, a dream of a tree, and Daniel comes in. He comes in and explains the dream. It is a dream of a great tree that is knocked down by a rock that rolls down a hill and knocks the tree down. And Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You're the tree, and you're going to get knocked down, not killed, but knocked down." And sure enough, that happens later on. For a period of time, Nebuchadnezzar is out of it. He actually becomes almost like a wild animal, mentally, something. And then he returns to his senses after a period of time, and he gives testimony that God is God. Now, what's interesting is that we have what are called the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicles. These are actually tablets that tell Nebuchadnezzar's story, and there's a gap in the middle. And I don't know for sure that that's what is taking place here. It's because we're not going to write about the humiliation, but it's certainly an interesting coincidence that we have those chronicles that tell of his early years, but all of a sudden it stops and then picks up again a bit later on. Next, we have another story of a rise and fall of a king. This time it's Belshazzar. Now, we know from history, I mean, the Bible's calling Belshazzar the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, it's more of his grandson-in-law, but still it's a descendant through marriage. And Belshazzar then is a generation or two later after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and he sees some handwriting on the wall. He is what they've done. They actually take the vessels from the temple, and they're having a big party and disregarding God and sort of dishonoring God. And a hand shows up. That sounds weird. Is it just like a disembodied hand? I don't know. But a hand shows up and writes something on the wall, and he sees it, and everybody else sees it, and they like, what is that? And it's got some words, and Daniel comes in and interprets it, and it's a prophecy that Belshazzar is going to be killed, and the kingdom is going to the kingdom of Babylon isn't going to be kingdom of Babylon anymore. And sure enough, that night, we have somebody comes in and kills the king, and now the Persians are going to take over. Now we have that same story, not with the handwriting, but about the takeover, where Cyrus records his takeover of Babylon. He says he came to Babylon, and there was a king there, and he walked in and took over, and they just opened the gates, and he walked in and took over. And it wasn't even a battle. So you have an independent telling of sort of the same story. Next, we have another rescue story, Daniel being rescued from the lion's den. This time, it's not Daniel's friends that are mentioned. This time, it's Daniel himself. But still, it's a rescue story, supernatural rescue story. And finally, we have a night vision of 4 beasts. Notice how chapter 2, we had an image of 4 kingdoms. Now we have a vision of 4 beasts. And we're going to take a look at those two, chapter 2 and chapter 7. We're going to look at those together because I think they are telling something of the same story in the image and in the vision. So here's Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 side by side. Daniel chapter 2 has a vision of a great statue. And we find out that this is, excuse me, this is representing kings and kingdoms. And then in Daniel chapter 7, we have a vision of beasts that are rising up from the sea, a series of 4 different beasts, just as the statue is divided into 4 parts. So the head of the statue is made of fine gold. You find out that that's Babylon. And in Daniel 7, a lion with wings comes out of the sea, which actually was used as an image of Babylon. I've seen panels. If you go to the Boston Museum, you walk and you'll see a big panel, and there's a lion with wings on it, and it comes from the gates of Babylon. Next, you have in the statue you have you look down from the head going down. Its breasts and arms are of silver. So you start with gold, and you go to silver, and you get the idea that this represents the Medes and the Persians. Likewise, there's a bear with 3 ribs in its teeth. Now, what do the ribs represent? People have come to various conclusions. So I'm not even going to guess. But that's the next big kingdom that comes about. If you want, you can go with Mesopotamia and Persia to the east, but also they had taken over and did hold on to the kingdom of Lydia in the west, what we look at as Western, the area of Turkey, the area that contains Western Anatolia, places like Ephesus and in various cities there in the west. So is that it? I don't know. But here's a map of Babylon. This was Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon and his empire. After him come the Medes and the Persians, and so their empire is going to extend all the way to Lydia in the west, and the Persians are going to go all the way to the Indus River to India, and at various points they will take over Egypt as well. So the Medes they'll capture Lydia. That's actually before Babylon is even taken. And then Cyrus the Great comes down, as I said before, he captures Babylon without a fight. They will go down and capture Egypt. And eventually the Persians will try to cross over the Hellespont, and they'll actually try to invade Greece. Now, that's not going to go so well. You'll have the Persians do it first under Darius and the famous Battle of Marathon, where somebody runs back to say, one of the Greeks runs back to Athens and says, "Hey, we won," runs the first marathon. Um, probably not a good idea to do that without having practice, because the guy who did that fell over and had a heart attack. But then 10 years later, the Persians again tried to take Greece, and that didn't go so well either. That was in the days of Xerxes. And eventually they decide, we're going to let Greece do its own thing, and we're no longer going to try to invade there. So we have the breast and arms of silver, the bear with 3 ribs in its teeth. Maybe that's where we got it, maybe not. Next, we have the belly and thigh of bronze in the statue as we're working our way down. That's speaking of the Greek Empire. And in Daniel 7, it is pictured as a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. Of course, a leopard is the fastest land animal that you have. It's, I think, representing Alexander the Great, who is, he'll pass for Greek. He's actually from Macedon, which is north of Greece. And within a period of 10 years, he's going to march all the way across, actually into India. And he will make the Persian Empire his empire. And so that is notice that's the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. Next you have, and notice we've had 3. This is the 4th now. The legs of iron and clay, and then 10 toes. And the question is that going to be somebody named Antiochus? We're going to talk about him in just a second. Or is that the Roman Empire? And notice I put question marks by each one. When we come to the vision of the beast, it's a beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. So notice the 10 toes and the 10 horns. Whatever they are, they seem to be talking about the same thing. But that's the question of whom is this speaking? If we continue on, let's just get the whole story. At the end of the Daniel 2 vision, all the previous kingdoms are destroyed by a stone that is cut without hands. And that's the coming of the Lord and his kingdom. And in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days takes his seat and passes judgment. So again, the Lord wins. In chapter 2, a new kingdom is established that will never be destroyed. In Daniel 7, his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. So the visions seem to be the same, and we can pretty well trace them up, except to try to ask, what's that 4th kingdom about? We put some question marks about that. Now, as we go to chapter 8 and compare chapter 7 to chapter 8, that's actually a different section of Daniel. Daniel's giving chapter 8 in the first person. In Daniel 7, it was Daniel said this, and Daniel saw that. Back in Daniel 7, the dream comes in the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now the vision is given in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, still in the Babylonian period. In Daniel 7, we had seen successive beasts rise out of the ocean, representing Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, Greece, and we called it that other kingdom. Was it Rome? Was it Antiochus? What was that? And I left that open. In Daniel chapter 8, we will see a vision of a ram standing by a canal, attacked by a goat coming from the west. And this time we're told, they're specifically identified, where one represents the Medes and the Persians, and the other represents Greece. So notice the 2 here represent the middle 2 in Daniel chapter 7. We don't have to guess at it. The passage itself explains it. Then we have a terrible beast. Remember, the other kingdom gives rise to that terrible beast that has 10 horns. And here in Daniel 8, we have the large horn broken and gives way to 10 horns. So again, we're back on the same page of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, but without a separate kingdom. It's only that large horn that's broken and gives way to 10 horns. In Daniel 7, out comes a small horn that pulls up the 3 previous horns, that utters great boasts, that makes alterations in times and laws, and wages war against the saints, that is, the holy people, God's people, and wins against them, at least for a time. Now, in Daniel 8, out comes a small horn that grows exceedingly, that magnifies itself against heaven, that removes the regular sacrifice and throws down the temple, that flings ground. Flings truth to the ground. These seem to be on the same page, describing the same event. In Daniel 7, the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Notice time, that's 1. Times, more than 1. Maybe only 2, maybe more. And half a time, so that's at least 3.5. In Daniel 8, this small horn endures for 2,300 mornings and evenings. If you do the math, that's roughly about 3.5 years. We're talking about the same period of time, I think. In Daniel 7, then sovereignty, dominion, and greatness are given to the saints of the Most High. In Daniel 8, then the holy place will be properly restored. God's people win in the end. Did you catch that? They're telling the same story. Now, one more, and you say, you haven't really put all these together. That's because I think they're all talking about the same thing, and I want you to see it. And now Daniel chapter 11 is the passage that sort of ties it all together, in my opinion. Daniel 11, verse 2. Now I will tell you, and this is an angel speaking to Daniel, and now I'm going to tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, and then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. So you have 3 more kings, and then a fourth. I do the math, and I think, eventually to the king Xerxes. Remember, he's the one who tries to invade Greece, not just in a quick run, but he actually marches into Greece, um, actually makes a mess of Greece, but he doesn't keep it. He does march into it. He burns Athens to the ground, but eventually he goes home, and Greeks are left to Greece. And notice verse 3, and a mighty king will arise. Now, it doesn't say he's going to arise immediately. Alexander the Great doesn't come for another 130, 140 years, something like that. And a mighty king will arise, and I think we're talking Alexander, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. So he's going to arise, he's going to do a lot of stuff, but then it's not going to be a kingdom that lasts, though not to his own descendants. Notice he doesn't pass on his kingdom to his own seed, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides him. And when Alexander lay on his deathbed, and he lay on his deathbed, he was like 33 years old. He had gone from starting off in Macedonia and had marched all the way to India and never lost a battle and took the whole Persian Empire, took Egypt, took all of these things. But he got very sick coming back to Babylon. And as he lay on his deathbed, his generals gathered around him and said, "To whom are you going to give your kingdom?" Because he had no children yet. He had a wife that was pregnant. And he whispered out to the strongest, which meant that when he died, his generals all grabbed pieces, and they pulled apart his kingdom, and each grabbed their own piece. One guy grabbed Egypt, and another one grabbed Syria, and another one grabbed Macedon, and they fought among them. There were a bunch of them at first, and then it whittled down to about 4. Verse 5, then the king of the south, let me just say, the king of the south is going to be a reference to Egypt. The king who, one of his generals grabbed Egypt, and that was Ptolemy, who's going to become the king now of Egypt, initially ruling it in Alexander's name, and then after a while he just said, there is no more Alexander and no more children, so he's just going to set up his own kingdom. And both he and his son and his grandson, going down, 14 generations, they're all going to be named Ptolemy. Makes it really easy. The king of Egypt from this time on is going to be named Ptolemy, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. Notice the king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion indeed. What happens is Ptolemy has a general under him. And I said that all the various generals were fighting each other. And Ptolemy stays home in Egypt, but he sends Seleucus to the north to fight against some of these other generals. And Seleucus wins. He becomes the big winner. And he grabs Syria. Initially, Syria all the way, west off the map. East off the map. And he managed to get a good chunk of Anatolia as well. And makes his capital there on the coast. He makes his own capital and names it after his own father, Antioch. His father's name was Antiochus. And so Antioch is going to be the capital of Seleucus. And Ptolemy said, "Hey, nice job. Bring all that stuff back to me." And Seleucus says, "No, I've got it." And so they actually break off from each other, and Seleucus is going to have his own kingdom, which is going to be quite a bit larger than Ptolemy's. Now, having Egypt was a big deal because there's a lot of food there, and it's all sort of compact, and you've got natural defenses, the desert and the sea. Seleucus has a lot more territory. Is it quite as wealthy? I don't know. You'd have to take that up with them. Verse 6, and after some years they will form an alliance. They did. And the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. And they do make an alliance, but it soon falls apart. And so they are back to being two separate powers with the little tiny kingdom of Judah in between. And Judah's a little bit, during this period, like a ping pong ball, first under the Ptolemies and then under the Seleucids, and it goes back and forth. The Ptolemies at one point actually come in and capture the city and tear down part of the wall, but of Jerusalem. And so you've got the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And eventually, I'm skipping over a lot of history, which is given in chapter 11. It's sort of blow by blow. But finally, I don't want to spend too much time here. We get to a king by the name of Antiochus IV. Remember, Seleucus had named the city of Antioch after his father, but now I go a number of Antiochus down, so I've got to the fourth. And Antiochus IV, his father Antiochus III had gotten into a fight with Rome and had lost. Now, notice I've got Rome over there. I can see Italy in the west. And Antiochus IV had become a hostage in Rome for his father's good behavior. But after his father died, Antiochus IV, I used to think it was that he escaped. Well, I think they may have let him go. They were just changing hostages. But he does make his way back home, and he becomes the new king. And he decides, I want to be not just the king of the Seleucids, I want to be now another Alexander the Great. But I'm not going to fight Rome because I've been over there and they're really big, but they're sort of concerned with their end of the Mediterranean. And meanwhile, I'm going to try to. Alexander never went to Italy anyway, so I don't need to go to Italy to be like Alexander. But I'm going to go all the way to the east, and he does. And he needs money for this, so what he does, he makes some appointments in Judah. Um, he arranges with somebody for the high priest to have an accident, and then he puts a man of his own choosing on into the high priesthood of Judah, with the understanding you're going to go and raid the temple treasury and give me all the money so that I can fund all of my military accomplishments. And it gives a really bad taste into the mouth of the Jews. This all takes place, and secrets don't remain secret, so it becomes known. And so Antiochus is doing all these things in Judah and against the Jewish people. Next, he makes an invasion of Egypt against the Ptolemies. And he wins. He wins big. He actually has the Ptolemies bottled up right on the northwestern corner of the Nile River, of that Nile River Delta. There's an ancient city called Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. And the Ptolemies are bottled up there. And it looks like he's going to just capture the entire country, when the gate opens up and out comes a delegate from Rome. Remember Rome, way over there? And Antiochus had been to Rome. The way they tell the story, this Roman delegate comes up to Antiochus and says, Rome wants you to go home. Leave Egypt. And Antiochus says, well, you didn't bring an army with you. I don't see what the threat is. Rome wants you to leave Egypt, go home. Now, remember, Antiochus has been to Rome. He's seen the Roman legions. He knows what they can do. And he says, well, I'll think about it. And the Roman representative, his name is Populaeus, he's carrying a stick, and he takes the stick and he draws a circle. Notice here in the picture, he draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus, who's standing in the middle, and says, you can think about it all you want, but give me your answer before you step out of that circle. And Antiochus thinks and thinks, and finally he says, okay, I'm packing up my army and I'm going home. And he's been incredibly embarrassed. I mean, he's got his whole army there. And yet one man shows up and says, go home, and he's going to obey and go home. Now, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Remember, they weren't very happy with Antiochus for having pulled all those things with the high priest and having the high priest murdered and all those things. So they've heard a false news report that Antiochus has died in Egypt, and he hasn't died. And so they have fomented a rebellion, and they have kicked out the high priest, and they've kicked out the garrison that are left behind. And they're having a delightful time. And Antiochus comes back to Jerusalem, and he is angry, and he's frustrated, and he wants to take it on somebody. So he comes into Jerusalem and he says, There's no rebellion here. I'm in charge." And he imposes some very stringent regulations. He says, the problem with these Jews is they're Jews. I'm going to turn them into good Greeks. And so from now on, Jews are no longer allowed to assemble for prayer. Observance of the Sabbath is forbidden. Possession of the scriptures is illegal. Circumcision is illegal. If a baby is found having been circumcised, the baby is killed, and then the body of the baby is hung around the neck of its mother, and she's killed as well. This is very serious. Dietary laws are illegal. Everyone is going to worship in good Greek fashion. Antiochus has a statue of Zeus placed on the temple grounds right next to the giant sacrificial altar just outside the temple. And everybody's going to worship Zeus, and everyone's going to sacrifice pigs to Zeus, not just in the temple in Jerusalem, but we're going to go out throughout the surrounding communities all around Jerusalem, all around the kingdom of Judah. And everybody's going to turn into a good worshiping Greek. So pagan sacrifices are mandated. Now, Judah, as we said, has been stuck in the middle, and this leads to the Maccabean revolt. There's an entire class that I've taught just on the Maccabees. Don't have time for that. But a Jewish family leads a revolt. What they do is they come to this little tiny village of Modin to the west of Jerusalem, and this high priest, he refuses to do it, and soldiers try to make him, and his sons jump into it, and they kill the soldiers, and a revolt breaks out, little tiny village revolting, but it grows and it grows and it grows to the point where Judah is able to eventually, after 3.5 years, count them. Remember how we talked about that 3.5 year of the prophecy? Where after 3.5 years, they regain the temple and they cleanse it. Now, that doesn't end the war. They're going to be fighting the Seleucids for a long time. But you have that Maccabean revolt, and that takes place in 166 BC, led by a priest, Mattathias, and his sons. One of his sons is named Judas the Maccabee. That's why we call it the Maccabean revolt. That's the word Maccabee means hammer. So Judas the hammer, because he really hammers the Seleucids. And the temple is finally liberated and cleansed, and our Jewish friends to this day still commemorate the cleansing of the temple, the liberation and cleansing of the temple. They call that the Feast of Dedication. The way you say that in Hebrew is Hanukkah. And so when they celebrate Hanukkah, that's what they're celebrating, that entire event. Now, chapter 11, verse 29, is part of that prophecy, and it's telling that entire story. At the appointed time, he will return. That this is this king from the north. He will return into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim, Kittim is their word for Italy or Rome. You know, they didn't have it exact, but it was somewhere out there. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action, so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. That's exactly what took place. Indeed, it is so exact, this prophecy was fulfilled so exactly that critics of the Bible normally will say, well, it had to be written after the event. The book of Daniel, at least this portion of the book of Daniel, had to have been written after 166 BC. Now, the problem is that we have copies of the book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and just recently they used some AI, artificial intelligence, to work on the dating of those books, and the results came out that it's a lot older than anyone had claimed. And we as Christians say, well, that doesn't surprise us because we think Daniel wrote Daniel quite a bit earlier. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, now that's not the original copies, but those are copies, and yet even they're older. And that's really putting a real challenge to biblical scholars, not to biblical scholars who believe the Bible's the Word of God. We don't have any problem with that. But to those who are naysayers, that's giving them all sorts of headaches right now as we speak. Well, chapter 11, verse 31, and forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. That's what happens in the temple. They will set up the abomination of desolation. That was a statue of Zeus that was put up at the temple, right out. I used to think maybe they put it in the Holy of Holies. I've gone back and read the accounts. It was just outside the temple, just so that everybody could see it. If it was in the Holy of Holies, nobody would have ever seen it, because only the high priest was allowed there. So right next to the great altar outside of the temple, this abomination of desolation. So here's Antiochus Epiphanes. He comes on the heels of Alexander's generals. He magnifies himself against the Jews and against their God. I'm just quoting from the prophecies of Daniel chapter 11. He puts a stop to the sacrificial system and makes alterations to the law. He attempts to overturn the truth of the scriptures. He has power over the nation of Israel. His sway over the temple endures for approximately 3.5 years, 2,300 mornings and evenings. Of course, that's rounded off, but that's okay. And then the holy place is ultimately properly restored. He's telling the story of the Maccabean revolt and the events leading up to it. And we have that all laid out very carefully here in Daniel chapter 11. And that helps us to better understand what was going on in those visions in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapters 7 and 8. It's all telling the same story. Now we get to chapter 12 and verse 1. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued. Now, a time of distress is being described here. And we hear this in chapter 12, and we ask, is this the abomination of desolation brought about by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC? Within a few years, that would be overturned. Is this the destruction of the temple brought about by Titus in 70 AD? Because the temple is going to be properly restored in the days of the Maccabees, but eventually there would be other outsiders, not Antiochus, not Seleucids, but Romans who would come in and destroy the temple. And by the way, when they did, the very first thing they did, as soon as they destroyed the temple, they built a pagan altar where the old altar had been, and they offered pagan sacrifices. Another abomination of desolation. Or is this something in the future? And people, even scholars of good standing are divided as to the three of these. I look at it and say, could it be all three? We'll see. Chapter 12, verse 2 says, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. A final resurrection. And let me just say, this is the first time that the Old Testament had clearly given a very clear prophecy of a future resurrection, a general resurrection. There had been hints along the way. Some I would have picked up, some Jesus had to point out. I think of when he had his discussion with the Sadducees. But nothing really clear until now. And so from this time on, many of the Jews are going to say, yeah, there's a future resurrection. And this is where they take it from. Verse 4, but as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. And it certainly did, and it certainly has. Now, one more prophecy that we want to look at, and this is chapter 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Daniel chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. Notice this isn't Darius the Great who becomes king of the Persians, but somebody of the same name who at an earlier date is made governor or king over the Chaldeans. That's going to be part of the Persian Empire. Verse 2, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Remember that prophecy that that Jeremiah had given, that there would be a 70-year captivity, And Daniel has been living in the midst of that, and he's been doing the math, and he's saying, okay, I've been here since 605 BC, and by now we're up to close to that 70 years. Are we there yet? Is this the end of it yet? And so, verse 3, so I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplication with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. He's reading in Jeremiah that it said, if you repent, then I'll bring you back. And so he's saying, well, maybe we didn't repent, so maybe I should repent on behalf of all the people. And he offers a prayer of repentance. Verse 4, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. Daniel had been faithful since he's been over here in Babylon, but he's praying on behalf of the nation of Israel, which is no longer a nation, but is still a scattered people. And so, verse 6, moreover, we have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, our fathers, and all the people of the land. You get down to verse 20. He's been speaking and praying. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel. Now, when it says the man Gabriel, I think it's a male, but I think it's an angel. Okay. I'm not going out on too much of a limb here. I think most people agree. This Gabriel is an angel. And notice, whom I had seen in the vision previously came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. Here's his message, verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Notice 70 weeks. That would be, if we're talking literal weeks, I don't think we are, but that would be 490 years, or 490 days, I'm sorry. However, I think we're using the same pattern, and most scholars agree. We seem to be using the same pattern that Ezekiel had set up, where a day represents a year, which would mean 70 weeks instead of 490 days would be 490 years have been decreed. So these 70 weeks, 77s, if you want to say, notice what takes place: to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. That has to do with the temple, but that's actually things that Jesus accomplished. If you just read it through the eyes of what Jesus came and did. The prophecy continues, verse 25, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, not that it's going to be done yet, but the decree is going to be given, until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Notice how it divides it up, and it doesn't give an explanation as to why it's dividing it. It will be built again with plaza and moat even in times of distress. If we look at the different decrees that were given by the Persians regarding the temple, well, Cyrus the Great had given a decree back in 539 BC that the Jews were allowed to return and rebuild the temple. After this, Darius the Great had allowed them to complete the temple. It had actually been interrupted. That was 520 BC. Artaxerxes had given permission for Ezra to bring about another return, and he had given some decrees. It wasn't completely clear what he was allowed to do. There's a reference to the wall of the city, and then finally Artaxerxes had commissioned Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2, where he was allowed to rebuild the walls. So 4 different decrees at 4 different dates. If we look for the date of the giving decree and we add 483 years, remember the 490 minus the last week. With Cyrus, that brings you to 56 BC. Nothing happened. With Darius, that brings you, starting at 520 BC, where he gave them permission to continue and complete the temple. You have Artaxerxes that allowed Ezra to make his journey, and then Artaxerxes also who gave Nehemiah his marching orders. That brings us to 37 BC. Nothing particular happened, although that is when Herod the Great was finally took back and became king of the Jews. He had been commissioned as king of the Jews a few years earlier, but he was seated now in Israel, but I don't think that's referenced here. You have 27 AD, if you look at when Ezra was commissioned, and that would work for the coming of Messiah. That would work for the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And then Nehemiah, you go forward to 39 AD. Well, nothing happened there either. So is this depicting something in the New Testament? I think maybe it is. Now, here's the Maccabean interpretation. This is one of the Jewish interpretations that have been suggested. And notice it seeks to make sense of why the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks are divided there, where it notes that you go from the first fall of Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar first came in and took Daniel hostage and said that from now on Jerusalem is still a city, it still has a Jewish governor, but now it's under my control. From there to the murder of the high priest that had led to the Maccabean revolt, that's 171 BC. That was the 62 weeks or 434 years. That works, except that notice it wasn't a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. It was when Jerusalem first started having issues of being taken by a foreign power. So it's not quite so clear cut. And then it notes that you have a 7-week period, that is 49 years from the time when the temple was destroyed, to permission to rebuild the temple. Now, it wasn't completed then, but permission to rebuild the temple. But our prophecy isn't about the temple. Our prophecy is about the walls of the city. So, and then it notes that in the middle of the 70th week, the temple was desecrated by Antiochus the Fourth. That part works. So parts of it work, parts of it don't fit exactly. We have to wiggle it a little bit to try to make it fit. That's the Maccabean interpretation. Next we have, and I'm calling this the dispensational interpretation. This was suggested that instead of having, in order to get the 69 weeks and make it fit up to the crucifixion of Jesus, you have to take those years and turn them into lesser years, years of 360 days each, and then readapt them, to expand the period. And you have to wiggle it a bit to get from Nehemiah's the permission that he had to get to the crucifixion of Jesus. And supposedly it comes out to very, very, very close. If they're correct on when they have placed the crucifixion of Christ, of course, there, was Christ crucified in 30 AD or 33 AD, somewhere in that period. We don't know exactly. I don't know exactly. Let me say, and then this is dispensational. So what is claimed then is that from the crucifixion of Christ, suddenly the clock is stopped, and you have a parenthetical period, the church age, at which time the dispensationalist view is that there's 2 future comings of Jesus, and one takes place at the beginning of the 70th week, and one takes place at the end of the 70th week, so that you have the quote-unquote rapture. That's not a term that the Bible uses, but what it tries to distinguish is 2 different future comings of Jesus, one where he gathers his people, and the other where he comes again. He also gathers his people then too, but the focus then is on the second coming of Christ. So our dispensational friends, and I actually came from this camp. I actually started the Bible college I attended and from which I graduated was dispensational in its theology, in its eschatology, and I bought into this. And then at a later date, I began to say, does the Bible really teach all these things, or was this sort of superimposed? And so I was dispensationalist. I am not any longer. Let me just confess that. I hold a different view. I still think Jesus is coming, but I think he's coming not once, not twice, but one time. But this is the dispensational view. Third view is the historical interpretation, which would see the first order to rebuild the walls. This isn't in Nehemiah's day, but a bit earlier. This is when Ezra was being sent back. He was going to be allowed to go back and do some things there. And I don't have to juggle the years. It fits exactly to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. It works very nicely. And then, so he comes, and that's the beginning of the 70th week. In the middle of the 70th week, he is cut off, the cross, after about 3.5 years. And then after that, Jerusalem's destroyed, and it was destroyed in 70 AD, but not exactly at the end of the 70th week, but within a generation, Jerusalem was destroyed. And so that would work nicely, and I don't have to wiggle the years. I don't have to change anything. It just works very nicely. Now, which of these is to be understood? Now, let me say the dispensational versus the historical interpretation. Um, I don't think they can both be right, but you can have the Maccabean and the historical interpretation, both giving a picture of something that actually happened, and that would work. That would work, and it doesn't bother me to see prophecies having multiple applications, multiple, can I say it even, multiple fulfillments. I think that's okay to see that. Now, Daniel chapter 6, or chapter 9, verse 26, let me just finish this up. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and not have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come. I think this is somebody other than the Messiah. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city. Jesus did not destroy the city. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. And you say, well, what's that talking about? Notice verse 27, he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations, you see that abominations again, abominations will come who makes desolate, an abomination of desolation, which is the same wording that we saw in Daniel chapter 11. There it was describing what Antiochus did with the temple, bringing a pagan idol and desecrating the temple. Notice here it's described as happening as well. Is this the same event or is this another similar event? Notice until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. This is a side footnote, but let me just say, if you go to Jerusalem today, if you go to the Temple Mount today, there is on the Temple Mount a structure that does not allow Jewish worship or Jewish sacrifices to take place. It's called the Dome of the Rock. And from a religious point of view, and I'm not trying to be mean here, but from a religious point of view, it is still a abomination that makes desolate. Now, I don't think that's what the prophecy is talking about, but it just so happens that it continues even today. Now, Jesus referenced this in Matthew chapter 24, and starting in verse 15. Therefore, when you see, and notice what he calls it, the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. And then Matthew, the writer, adds a little note that our translators have put into parentheses, let the reader understand. I don't think Jesus said that because they weren't reading what he was saying. They were hearing what he was saying. But Matthew adds that little footnote, let the reader understand, because anybody reading this back in Jesus' day or in the New Testament period when it was written would have looked at this abomination of desolation. They would have said, well, that was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes 168 years ago. What is Jesus speaking of? But Matthew says, let the reader understand, because there's something you haven't noticed here. And Jesus continues, when you see that, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are his in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be on the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And this sounds like something in the future. So, abomination of desolation took place, yes, in the days of Antiochus IV, back in 168 BC. I think it took place again when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. They set up another pagan altar and sacrificed on it. Is it going to happen a third time? I don't know. However, the language here is strikingly similar to the historical description given by an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem. I'm speaking of Josephus in his book, The Wars of the Jews. And I'm quoting here, and we'll close on this note. The entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison. This is when the Romans came and surrounded Jerusalem. And the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. It almost sounds like Josephus had been reading Matthew or listening to the prophecy of Jesus. I don't think he had. I think he's just describing what he saw, but his description is close to word for word what Jesus said would happen with Jerusalem and the temple. Which tells me that Daniel is giving us prophecies that have all sorts of fulfillments in the days of the Maccabees, in the days of Jesus, and in the days when Jesus comes again.